Ulrich Brueckner, who's a professor of European Studies at Stanford University. He joins us now from Brussels. Good to have you back on the program, Professor. Can I start by asking you about the Ukrainian president's blistering speech to lawmakers in Berlin? Zelenskyy accused German politicians of failing to live up to their historical responsibility after the Holocausts, and he enshrined in the phrase "never again," which he invoked during this address. Can you explain to us, is this an effective tactic, do you think, on the Ukrainian president's part to really put pressure on European lawmakers?
Well, it is perfectly understandable for a president in a country that is in the situation that Ukraine currently is. Its country is invaded by a much, much more powerful military aggressor. It is an unprovoked war. And Ukraine is neither a member of the European Union, nor are they members of NATO. And therefore, they are basically left to themselves. And as we saw before, they can expect a lot of military support to help themselves, but they can expect any direct help from NATO or a single country. This is something that no parliament or a European or American leader is willing to take as a risk, because we talk about the largest military organization and NATO together are the ones with the biggest nuclear arsenal, and no one is willing to play with fire.
Well, that's right, because in his various addresses to world leaders, to world politicians, Zelenskyy has been warmly received, even though he was speaking to them via video link. We've seen standing ovations in the US Congress, in Germany, in the EU Parliament, in the Canadian Parliament, and others as well. But we still haven't got that decisive response that Zelenskyy is looking for. Why do you think that is? Why are Western leaders holding out and refusing to give Zelenskyy what he wants, and that is a no-fly zone over Ukraine?
Well, a no-fly zone sounds like a technicality. It's similar to what the big conservative leader in Poland, Kaczynski, is asking for, something like a NATO operation for humanitarian assistance in whatever form. What it would mean in both cases is crossing a red line, that a European Union or a NATO operation is actively engaging in the war. That means we are not supporting from the side, but we are actively on the pitch and start fighting a war with Russia. And this is something that can easily get out of control. It doesn't need an active decision by someone who loses nerves and presses the red button, but it can just be human failure, a misunderstanding of a signal, like whatever can happen in a war. And then we are engaged in a situation that does not only get out of control, but it could be the end of the planet.
Yes, and in a recent briefing to the media, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg was asked what is NATO's threshold at which it will finally intervene somehow. And the Secretary General said that NATO members were unified in its idea not to intervene because it doesn't want the conflict to spread beyond Ukraine. Is that a good position to take?
Well, it is a good position to minimize the risk. And we don't know what Russia's objectives are. And as long as we don't know this, we also don't know how far Russia is willing to go. And if we corner Putin by not only the massive use of our sanctions, but also by an active military engagement, Russia will be cornered. And what happens if an aggressor that is already crossing lines and violating international law on a large scale is willing to do? This is something that no one wants to test out, not only because we don't see the dimension of the problem, but we simply cannot foresee what the unintended consequences of this would be.
Yes, and by refusing or holding off on taking a tougher stance against Russia, do you think that NATO is giving the impression to Ukrainians, but also to the world at large, that perhaps it doesn't have the firepower to take on Russia's military?
Well, it is certainly not a matter of firepower. NATO is a very strong defense alliance, but it is a defense alliance. It's not an alliance that attacks another country. especially not a country that has the second largest nuclear arsenal. And this is the red line that so far no one in NATO is willing to cross, because as I said, this is not just a territorial conflict. This could be the end of this planet.
Okay, Professor, we will have to leave it there, but we really appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much again for joining us on TRT World.